I think about this one quote: people don't rise to the occasion, they sink to their level of training or systems. When did these systems come into play? And was there sort of a failure point in the middle in sort of this big crucible moment?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I've always had like some form of these systems. They've evolved over time for sure. And actually, funny enough, they evolved to get more complicated and then significantly more simplified. So, like when people think of these systems, they're like, "Oh, I need these like fancy toggles and Notion, and like I need like a template that just gives me everything." And it's like the truth is that if you're just getting high quality, high impact stuff done, like you kind of know, and the simpler the better. And this is, by the way, this is why we love using like tools like Linear at Loom over Jira, because Jira is like a really complex tool that has a bunch of overhead burden for like project managers and engineers for the sake of visibility. Whereas the tenet of Linear is like, how do we make it as simple as possible to get the work into the system so people can go back and focus on just the work? And so, like, you probably, if you're managing your own time, most people are probably not looking at your to do list. It's only you. And so, the amount of visibility that you need is commensurate with how much visibility do you need. And ideally, it's as little as possible. It's like, it should just feel natural that the strategies you're executing against feel like the right strategies. You want one cross functional partner to like check you on that. But just do that week by week. Have a to do list of things that you're focusing on one at a time, and then end up, like, if you have to end up doing a timetable. But ideally you don't have to get to the point where you're like scheduling out every 15 minutes of your day. I think that was like largely a fairly miserable experience for me.
So I guess thinking from the perspective of somebody who is about to enter into a place of like expanded scope and responsibility and are going to have to basically rethink their systems, when you look at the lessons you learned and how you were operating, are there certain lessons that you're now carrying with you as an engineering leader, or lessons that you would recommend to engineering leaders from this experience, outside of, or in addition to, or expanding on being really clear about your personal values, prioritizing and building around health, and then building around like a fundamental time unit, and like building out your schedule as like a fundamental block? Are there other insights that have changed how you operate as an engineering leader from those experiences?
One thing I learned tactically is that when you take on more scope, like inherently that means you need to scale more. And so there are a number of things that end up being really hard for people who are like scaling within a new level of scope for the first time, and then are really hard for people who have done it themselves, but then aren't good at teaching that behavior to their directors and leaders. People are bad at setting up systems of delegation. And so an example of this is we were scaling on the people side quite a bit as we were scaling up headcount. And we ended up having to figure out, okay, like when like there's like a lot of these patterns and problems that your reports will bring to you where they're like, oh, we just can't do this much work. Or like the team is like always underwater. They're always underwater. They're always firefighting. And the first thing that, like, the first inclination for like a new leader that's taking over extended scope is to say, okay, what are the individual problems? Whereas instead, like the thing that most leaders should focus on is, well, what are your systems of like scaling out here? Like, you're telling me that there's a bunch of work that's coming in and your team's like running red hot. What is the nature of that work? What work are you doing? And then most importantly, what work are you doing that only you can do? And how do we make sure you do more of that work than any other type of work, and get you more people under you who can do that kind of work, or give you less responsibility because you don't have the means to scale out your team to handle the amount of work that your team's already trying to take on. And I think that step gets skipped. And so systems of delegation, like, there are going to be a bunch of processes that your reports own that maybe they shouldn't, they should give to other people. There are going to be a bunch of tasks and work that like they think are really high priority, but then when you globally prioritize the list of things they're doing, you realize actually it's not that high priority. Stop doing that. Let's like set expectations properly with the rest of the org and figure out how to scope down the amount of work you all are doing. So those things are like recurring patterns that I definitely learned in straddling the people role. The second thing is, like, there's two things that aren't utilized in engineering nearly enough: budgets, and then like whenever there's two departments communicating, triple verification, which is the thing that you end up having to do in the people world all the time, because every system is a people system, which basically means that it's not like whether or not you want to take on error. It's like, how much error do you want to take on? Like, how much error do you want to take on with this process today? And it will happen. Like there will be so much error that happens, right? Like everything from like, a system like being hooked up automatically for deprovisioning, and then all of a sudden people know this person got let go when they shouldn't have known, to like, problems of like people operations and talent thinking that they know who owns the final amount of like how much you can negotiate on salary. And actually they don't. And all of a sudden the candidate is led to believe that they're getting a lot more cash than they're actually going to get. Like I've seen all of the errors. And so triple verification is so critical. The first thing I did when I came back into the engineering world is I was just like, hey guys, like everybody, here's the Slack thread. Write down the things you're working on in this quarter coming up ahead of quarterly planning. Write down the things you're scared that we're not talking about. And then write down any blockers that you think you're going to have. And everybody's like, but we've already done product planning. Like, why do we need to do this? And I'm like, because you did product planning in your own little like silos and you have no idea what other people are thinking. We ended up finding 50 different, like, I'm not even kidding, 50 or 60 different misalignment points between all of the EMs. And we were able to get ahead of that before the quarter started. And so that's like triple verification is incredibly important. Another thing is like like within budgets, it's like how much error are you willing to take on within the system? I think a lot of engineers chalk up like observability dashboards and they're like, oh, well, we know like our SLAs or SLOs. So like, yeah, of course, like, we know when errors rise, and it's like, but how many of those errors are acceptable? And like, you have to do this within people because like everything is driven by finance. Like it's like, if you run out of money, you run out of money. It doesn't like, it doesn't matter. If a system goes down in engineering, you lose things. So it's not like, it's like the opportunity cost of time now in order to not lose things in the future is different than the opportunity cost of implementing something now, knowing that it's going to cost real dollars. Right. And so like, I think it's really important that engineers like apply budgets to a lot of things that they do. Like what budgets, how do you want to use like the kernel of a budget to help you think about how much trust you have or how much you think you trust a system? And then within that system, it's like not only a production system, how much you think you trust like your regression systems or the system, like how much you think other people trust your team. Like how buggy is your system? Like, are there people in other teams that are like, oh man, like this team ships stuff and it just always breaks our shit. And like, like so we can't trust that team. And now there's like these cultural ripple effects. I think budgets are incredibly important. And it's something that I really didn't realize until I spent more of my life in Google Sheets and Excel than I care to want to ever spend again in my life.